I grew up in a small fellowship in Charleston, West Virginia. So it feels like home to me to be in small congregations like this one. I want to congratulate you for holding this precious space together and creating something meaningful in an intimately relational way. It really matters that you do this. I know when I grew up, we felt so small that it felt like what we did didn't matter. But I just want to assure you that what you do ripples out and your power and influence matters in ways you might not even be able to see. So thank you. Thank you for holding this space. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for caring for one another. I've been part of Unitarian Universalism since it formed through a merger of Unitarianism and Universalism in 1961. And before that, I was in a family whose life revolved around that Unitarian fellowship. My parents found Unitarianism because Adlai Stevenson, whom they adored, was a Unitarian. From this vantage point of almost 70 years, I can say with certainty that Unitarian Universalism is indeed a living tradition. I've watched fads and trends come and go in our faith, and also a slow evolution and deepening of how we practice and how we articulate who we are. When I was a kid, the flaming chalice wasn't a thing. We didn't have it. We didn't know what it was. They're just things that we take for granted now that are just who we are, that have been part of our evolution. We are indeed a people who endure dust and heat, and at our best, humbling grace. So I was invited here today to share about what happened this past summer at the UUA's General Assembly. Because there are likely folks here today who have no idea what General Assembly even means or is, or why it might be important, I want to start by creating some context. It might feel unnecessary for some of you, but I want to be sure that people aren't starting out bewildered about what I'm even talking about. I hate it when that happens. Has anybody here ever been to a General Assembly, a UUA General Assembly? Okay. Oh, you have?
It was in the Twin Cities.
When it was in the Twin Cities in 2010. Yeah. So that's the closest it's been for a while. It's the annual meeting of Unitarian Universalists. It was a merger thing. The Unitarians used to have May meeting, and the Universalists were a little more ad hoc about it. But when they merged, they decided that every June they would have meetings. Generally speaking, it meets in a different city every year, all those 3 online General Assemblies. If you ask people who attend General Assembly what it's like, they will probably exclaim about the joy of worshiping with thousands of Unitarian Universalists, amazing music, great workshops, inspiring conversations. There's always a major lecture by an important figure in the world. Past speakers have included Martin Luther King Jr., Winona LaDuke, Mary Oliver, Krista Tippett, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. The annual Service of the Living Tradition marks the life transitions for our religious leaders, those who have entered ministerial fellowship or been credentialed as religious educators, those who have retired, those who have died. Many parts of the gathering are deeply powerful to bind us together as a people. But being a living tradition is present not only in that annual service that bears the name and honoring the endless stream of leaders who come and go, it's also present in the decisions that are made at our General Assembly. General Assembly is also and found. A board is elected there, which carries out the business between General Assemblies, but the General Assembly is the final authority about where Unitarian Universalism is going. Decisions get made there. General Assemblies shape the directions in which Unitarian Universalism will continue to evolve. And as such, they are usually full of at least some amount of heat and dust. This past year had some particularly heated aspects to it. I should add here that just because we like to say we're a living tradition and we like to sing about not being afraid of change doesn't mean that we joyfully embrace change at every step. There are two words I'm using, living and tradition. And tradition and living sometimes pull at each other. My colleague, Mark Bellatini, headed up the commission that created this hymnal, now the old one, but in the 1980s, the new one. He told me he got hate mail from people who were so angry about either what was in it or what wasn't in it. People were angry from every direction, what they wanted and didn't see in it. We're a faith of the free, and sometimes that's the free to complain, where everyone feels like everything would be better if they were in charge. Hence my title for this morning's sermon, Border Collies, herding Border Collies. If you know Border Collies, they are themselves herders. And so trying to lead Unitarian Universalists can be like trying to herd a bunch of herders who are trying to round up everyone for their own purposes. Amazingly, I have been to 39 General Assemblies now. I was a religious professional for 38 years before retiring. And in 2020, I was elected by the Assembly to serve with Charles Dumond as co-moderators of the UUA. That means that we basically are the chairs of the board, and we are responsible for the business at General Assembly. So when I was invited to talk about this, I said, I think I probably know about as much about it as anyone you could ask. But I was specifically invited to share about a major decision which was made this past General Assembly, a decision which was years in the making. And when I tell you what it was called, if you share my son's opinion, you will fall asleep by the time I am telling you what it was called. It was called Revisions to the Article 2 section of the UUA bylaws. I wish it had a better name. We had the Article 2 Study Commission at work for 2 years. Another dull name. Every time I said it at home, my son would start going, it's guaranteed to lose interest. I wish instead we had called it Who We Are and What Holds Us Together When We Are So Different, or something like that, because Article 2 of the UUA bylaws is about our purpose for existing and how we are to be in relationship with one another. This part of the bylaws is so important, and in a living tradition, it's so critical that we keep our eyes on it, that it's actually written in the bylaws that every 15 years we need to take a good look at it and maybe revise it. The way that they exist now mostly were written in the 1980s, and the last major changes were voted through in 1986. There have only been minor tweaks since. So I didn't even know until I was elected moderator and started for the first time paying attention to the UUA bylaws that Article 2 includes the principles and purposes on the back of your sheet. And you're not the only congregation that has these intimately woven into your congregation. I don't know where I thought the purposes and principles lived, but I certainly never imagined them in a legal document. Whether they belong there or not is a question that future General Assemblies, I hope, will discuss. But for now, that's where they are. I should also tell you how much I have loved the principles and purposes. I was a religious educator in the 1980s when they came out, and I immediately created a rainbow path where I aligned each of these with the color of the rainbow and had candles and had kids light the candles and memorize them and all kinds of things. But in fact, the principles were never created for congregational or personal faith statements. They are a covenant between UU congregations. They begin, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. So this is what congregations are covenanting with one another about. But like me, many people saw them as something a great deal more. So even though a lot of the people who are now voting about them weren't part of creating them in the 1980s, there was a lot of grief and fear about letting them go in the UUA bylaws. But the Article 2 Study Commission drafted a new covenant. for a different time. And later, I can tell you more about why, some of the reasons why, but there was a group called Save the Principles that was very adamant that changing this would really ruin Unitarian Universalism. It is of no surprise that we didn't all agree about it. And we took years doing amendments. We had thousands of UUs. And were you all engaged in this conversation? Did Kelly bring it to you, I hope? Because there were thousands of people engaged in this, and there were online forms you could fill out. And we got 900 amendments to it. And we tried to accommodate all the voices that we could. The first amendment that we entertained in 2023 was to keep the principles in the bylaws, and that failed by a wide margin. So we knew we could go on with the proposed change. So in 2023, we voted to support it for a year of study for congregations to take it back, knowing that in 2024, it would take a 2/3 majority to pass. And in fact, the changes were passed by an 80% majority in June. So I want to read you what we voted for so you know what it now says. I'm sorry to read the bylaws to you, but this is where it lives. So Article 2, Purposes and Covenant. Purposes. The Unitarian Universalist Association will devote its resources to and use its organizational powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. Its primary purposes are to assist congregations in their vital ministries, to support and train leaders, both lay and professional, to foster lifelong faith formation and spiritual development, to heal historic injustices, to support and encourage the creation of new UU communities, and to advance our values in the world. And then it has this line: the Unitarian Universalist Association will actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. Interestingly, in the entire 3-year process of discussing Article 2, very little feedback was given and no amendments were proposed about this section. There was discussion about the statement about transforming the world through liberating love being grandiose, but purpose statements are often unattainable statements of hopeful intention. And so that part was proposed by the Article 2 Study Commission and basically voted through. The next section is where there was a great deal of discussion, amendments, amending, rethinking. The values and covenant proposed replace the former statements of principles. And so if you want, you can look at the principles while I read them, and you'll see a number of familiar words in the new covenant. It's worded not as principles this time, but as values. And the thinking of the Article 2 Study Commission was, we're always talking about UU values, but what are they? So let's really spell them out. So here's how it goes. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritage of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Now, we did have some pushback about the assertion that love is at the center of our shared values. As a lifelong UU, I was surprised by this. After all, I grew up in the 60s stating weekly that love is the doctrine of this faith. So someone did a word count of the hymns in our hymnal, and love was the most common word used. One of my privileges in my professional career was creating what was then the Standing on the Side of Love campaign, which has become Side with Love. And over, people said to me, finally, something that really reflects who our congregation is and what we're doing. And people proudly wore the shirts to be the love people and put up banners. And so I was surprised when people said, what are you suddenly talking about love? To me, it was like, we've always done this. This is who we've been. And a couple of people articulated that beautifully this morning already. Anyway, Article 2 goes on. And they want to be really clear that while the principles, there's the first, people always talk about the first principle. They wanted to be really clear that these are interwoven and it's not like one's the most important, that you could put them in any order. And in fact, they wanted a website where they spun like a wheel. But instead, people started doing logos of flowers and all kinds of other things to put them in relationship to one another. But in point of fact, they're not like in priority order. So here's how they're listed in the bylaws, though. Interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence, familiar words. With reverence for the great web of life and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. Here's what's different about this. There's action with each value. So this one, we covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect, mutuality and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Second value, pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Again, familiar language in there. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and society at large. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Equity. We declare that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible, inclusive communities. So those are longer than the principles, but I think, the values themselves are the part that will likely be pulled out for starting conversations. As I said, and as the bylaws state clearly, these values are the covenant between congregations. Already, though, people are moving to do many things with them, just like I did with the Rainbow Path and the principles. Somewhere along the line, someone figured out that the values' first letters make up the acronym JET-PIG. Justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, generosity. It is a good mnemonic device, but congregations have already started getting little pigs in aviator suits and talking about when pigs fly and all kinds of other things for religious education that I'm honestly not all that delighted with, but folks are going to do what they're going to do. And some of the little pigs are pretty cute, I'll say. Some congregations will just keep using the principles in all the varied and wonderful ways I've seen them used over the years in quilts and stained glass windows and garden walks and curriculum. Nothing about changing the bylaws about how congregations interact with one another mandates how congregations behave internally. In fact, the new Article 2 reiterates what was in the old one, freedom of belief. Section 5 says, congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are central to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union, so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed. That's a pretty big change that just got voted through. I don't know if you were aware that happened, but I don't know how it'll unfold here or anywhere. as I said, I think some people will ignore it. It's the UUA bylaws. Like I said, I didn't even know what was in them until I became co-moderator. But the other major change was that besides the principles, we had a list of sources of our faith that listed out Jewish and Christian teachings and, prophetic men and women, things like that. The commission decided that list could be endless. And there were already like 3 people who wanted to add new things to it. And they felt like rather than keeping on getting a longer and longer list, to make a more general statement, an overarching statement would be more useful for the next 15 years. So they wrote inspirations. Direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are primary sources of Unitarian Universalist inspiration. These experiences, this was actually a huge amendment that came through, I should add, wasn't in the original one. But see, this is where people were like, wait, you have to be sure to put this in. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives. We draw upon and are inspired by sacred, secular, and scientific understandings that help us make meaning and live into our values. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which these sources were created and are currently practiced. Grateful for the experiences that move us, aware of the religious ancestries we inherit, and enlivened by the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. So there's no more list. As someone who spent hundreds of hours with the Article 2 Commission, I was one of the board reps on the commission, and also dozens more hours figuring out how to bring all those amendments, or as many as we could, to the General Assembly. I can tell you that I don't love every word of what was created. No one on that commission, and there were only 6 people, loved every word. We had passionate disagreements about many things and had to arrive at compromises that could hold everyone. And I'm sure everyone in this room could write your own list of values and word it in really particular ways that hold what you need. And that is foundational for who we are, that we would each do that. But I am tremendously proud that we found a way to make a collective statement of our values. I'll tell you 3 reasons why I am. The first is that as the decades went by, as much as I love the principles, I began to fear that they were becoming dangerously close to a creed. And the fact that we're a non-creedal faith means a lot to me. I don't want any set of words ever to be the encapsulation of what this faith is, because it's always bigger. I felt that the principles were becoming too definitive. Second, I love that we're a living tradition, a democratic faith made up of multiple opinions, voices, preferences, arguments, that we don't pretend that our faith is handed down from on high, but rather it's something that we generate between us. I love the transparency, sometimes theoretically only, because it is tedious sometimes too. But I love that everybody can get engaged with amendments and discussion and weighing meaning together. And finally, I'm glad when change brings new life to new generations. Even though that jet pig thing wouldn't be my cup of tea, I'm old. I'm not in charge anymore. If stuffed pigs in aviator suits give energy to younger people who are running things now, I say more power to them. This wasn't the only difficult or contentious conversation at the 2024 General Assembly, which, by the way, was conducted completely online, which is its own kind of work. We also don't agree as a faith about the events unfolding in the Middle East, though we managed to pass with about equal support statements of solidarity with the Palestinian people and a statement of support for the October 7th hostages. Democratic process is hard, and meeting online can make it uniquely difficult. Next year, we will hold a multi-platform event with people gathering both online and in person in Baltimore, Maryland. Charles and I will serve for our last General Assembly as co-moderators, and new leaders will be voted in. New projects will get set in motion. We aim to make next year's General Assembly a regathering, a recentering, because a vote of 80% is not consensus. The 20% who did not want the change need reassurance that their faith is not gone from them. It's been an honor to serve in this volunteer position after 38 years as a religious professional, and I'll admit that I'll be relieved to pass the challenge to someone else. This position has been rewarding and also sometimes painfully difficult, especially when people really question the motives of those of us who are devoting our time to a beloved faith. Leading a group of people who each feel like they could do it better from the sidelines isn't for the faint of heart. I close with these words from the Reverend Victoria Safford, who spoke them at General Assembly. We can neither be brought down nor saved by any bylaw change. It's the way we move that matters, the way we move forward together, the weight of the trust and compassion we bear for each other, the strength of our great covenant. However we vote, we put love at the center. This free faith we so cherish reveres the past, but trusts the dawning future more. We believe in evolution unfolding always, not unraveling, and revelation is never sealed.